The old rural cemetery lay in a shallow valley, and the morning fog clung stubbornly to the tilted crosses and uneven stones. Alexei had come here on an assignment from the regional archives to compare the inscriptions on the graves with entries in pre-revolutionary records. A routine job. Walk around with a tablet, match dates, note mistakes. The village was almost deserted. At the cemetery gate he saw only an old woman rummaging through a cloth bag. She watched him without a word, stepping aside to let him pass. The first rows of stones were easy to read, moss washed away by the rain, letters still sharp. Alexei typed names and years into his spreadsheet, checking them against the archive pages. Everything went smoothly until he turned at the sound of a rustle in the brush. A bird, just a thrush. When he looked back at the stone, he froze. 2 digits in the date of death had changed. Just a minute ago, it had read 1912. Now it said 1919. He checked the photo he had taken. Seconds earlier, it clearly showed the old number. He blamed tired eyes, but the pattern repeated in the next rows. On one grave, the patronymic had shifted. On another, the surname. Sometimes the difference was barely noticeable, but the tablet recorded the mismatch. In the 3rd row, he stopped dead. Carved into the granite was the name of his former university professor, a man who was still alive, as far as Alexei knew, still working at the university. The date of death, yesterday. Around him the silence thickened. Even the birds had stopped singing. By midday the fog had thinned, but the light felt wrong, muted, as if the air itself had turned to dust. Alexei walked deeper into the cemetery, each stone he passed carrying a name he didn't remember from earlier. His pulse quickened when he spotted a grave bearing the name of his cousin Anna. He hadn't spoken to her in months, but he was sure she was fine. The date of death etched below her name was today's. His hands trembled as he snapped a photo, glancing around for someone to confirm what he was seeing. The cemetery was empty. The old woman at the gate was gone. A low, dull hum began somewhere behind the rows. Not quite a sound, more a vibration in the bones. He tried to move toward the exit, but every turn seemed to pull him deeper in. The paths twisted, rearranged, leading him to newer and newer stones. He passed one that bore his father's name, then his mother's, then came one with his own. The date of birth matched exactly. The date of death was tomorrow. He stared at it until the letters began to blur, the stone seeming to exhale a faint, cold mist. From the corner of his eye, something moved, a thin shadow standing perfectly still among the graves, its face obscured by the branches of a dead tree. The hum grew louder. The names on the surrounding stones shifted again, but this time they all read the same, Alexei. The air grew heavier with every step, pressing on his chest, making each breath shallow. The shadow near the dead tree hadn't moved, but it seemed closer now, its edges fraying like smoke. Alexei backed away, his boots crunching on frost that hadn't been there moments ago. The hum became a rhythm, slow, deliberate, like something breathing just beneath the soil. He turned to run, but the paths were gone. Instead, gravestones stood shoulder to shoulder, forming narrow corridors that bent in impossible angles. Every stone bore his name, each one older, more weathered than the last, as if they'd been here for centuries. The ground under him soft, sagging like wet earth after rain. He looked down and saw his reflection in the puddle, only it wasn't his face. The eyes were black, the mouth slightly open, mouthing words he couldn't hear. A sudden sharp wind carried the faint sound of a shovel striking dirt. He followed it against his will, legs moving as if pulled by an unseen rope. Ahead was an open grave. The earth around it was freshly turned, and inside lay a coffin with the lid half open. In the coffin he saw himself lying perfectly still, his hands folded over his chest. The shadow finally moved, leaning over the pit, and he understood the dates on the stones weren't predictions. They were appointments, and his was due. As the first clump of soil hit his face, the hum stopped. The world above went silent. You don't expect the empty grave to be the loudest thing in a cemetery, but there it was, a strip of earth so cleanly outlined, so deliberate in its stillness, that it seemed to hum against the rest of the place. Not a sound you could hear, more like a pressure in the air, the kind that makes your teeth ache if you stand there too long. Alex had driven nearly 4 hours for this assignment, a puff piece about historical burial sites for a regional magazine that only occasionally dabbled in anything darker. The village cemetery wasn't remarkable in the way people romanticize old graveyards. No sprawling Gothic statues, no weeping angels or marble crypts. Just rows of modest headstones, the oldest ones tilting slightly, as if bowing toward the ground, names and dates slowly surrendering to lichen and weather. Except for the row near the north wall. It was incomplete, stones marking plots, but halfway down the line broke. There the grass was a duller green, the soil pressed flat in a rectangular shape, framed by 2 thin metal posts with a chain between them. No flowers, no weathered trinkets, no sign of disturbance. Just absence, so deliberate it felt intentional. The caretaker, a wiry man named Jensen, with a face like weathered driftwood, had shrugged when Alex asked about it. "That's the unfinished row," he'd said. "Been like that since before I started. Nobody goes near it. Don't have to tell and not to." When Alex pressed, Jensen had just smiled without humor. "Doesn't matter what you think about this place in the daylight. It changes after dark." Alex wrote it down even though he didn't believe it. Night in a cemetery was only scary if you let your brain run wild, and Alex prided himself on keeping things in check. That afternoon, he took his photos. Leaning markers, patches of moss, the odd cracked vase. He avoided the empty plot at first, telling himself he'd circle back when the light was better. But when he finally did, the shadows were long and the air had a sharpness that hadn't been there before. He crouched to get a low shot of the dirt rectangle, the chain posts framing it neatly in the lens. Through the viewfinder, the color of the soil looked wrong, darker, like it had been turned over recently. Alex lowered the camera. The dirt looked normal again. That night in his motel room he sorted through the shots. In 3 of them, the surface of the plot was different. Not just darker, uneven, like someone had been digging. And in the last one, taken seconds before he stood up, a faint shadow fell across the frame. It wasn't his. The cemetery at night didn't feel empty. It felt paused, not the kind of stillness where every movement, even your own, seems too loud. Alex hadn't planned to come back after dark, but the photographs bothered him. Not in a way he could explain to his editor, or even to himself. It was the same kind of quiet unease you get when you realize a stranger has been looking at you for longer than they should. The chain across the unfinished row was colder than it had any right to be when his hand brushed it. He crouched low again, flashlight angled down, expecting nothing but the same flat soil. It wasn't flat anymore. There was a slight mound in the center, as though the earth had risen from within, damp, darker than the surrounding ground, as if it had been turned over just minutes ago. Alex stepped back, the beam of light shivering in his grip. His first thought was some animal had burrowed up, but the dirt was too smooth, no scatter, no paw marks. From the corner of his vision, the headstones on either side of the empty plot seemed wrong. They were leaning toward it, just a fraction, as though time and gravity had begun pulling them inward. He killed the flashlight for a moment. The darkness pressed in, thick and absolute, the kind where your brain tries to invent shapes. That's when he heard it, not from the grass or the trees, but from beneath the ground. A shifting sound, like a body trying to roll over in a too tight bed. His instinct was to leave, to put the chain back and walk away. Instead, he raised the flashlight again. The mound was higher now. Not by much, maybe an inch, but enough that he knew it hadn't been his imagination. Then came the second sound, low and drawn out, the squeal of metal under strain. Alex's beam followed it to the posts. The thin chain sagged in the middle, links stretching as though something under the soil was pushing upward against it, invisible but deliberate. He took a step back and the earth shivered. Not the whole cemetery, not the ground under his feet, just the rectangle in front of him. The movement was small but rhythmic, like breathing. Alex didn't realize he was retreating until his foot struck another headstone. The name carved there was faded almost beyond recognition, but the date was clear, tomorrow's date, and the grave was empty. By the time Alex reached the cemetery gate, his lungs felt like they were pulling in more darkness than air. He didn't remember deciding to run, only the crunch of gravel behind him. Too slow to be footsteps, too heavy to be the wind. In the safety of his car's dim interior light, he looked at the photos again. The empty plot had been bare in daylight, just an unused strip of soil. But in each shot, there was something he hadn't noticed before, a faint depression at its center, darker than the surrounding grass. And in the last frame, taken just before he packed up, the depression was gone. In its place, the smallest rise like the start of a mound. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time his eyes closed, he felt the same slow rhythm in his mattress, like someone breathing beneath him. At 3:12 a.m., his phone lit up. No number, no message, just a photo. The unfinished row. Only now the mound was higher. The chain was gone. And in the center of the plot was a headstone, the same stone he'd backed into earlier. This time the name was clear, freshly cut. His name. He dropped the phone. It landed screen up on the floor, still glowing. The image began to shift, pixels crawling unnaturally, as if the dirt in the photo was being disturbed. A shadow rose from the mound, faint at first, then taller, sharper. The outline of a man's shoulders, head tilted forward, watching. Somewhere outside, a metal chain gave a sharp, final snap. The photo on the phone went black. The sound of slow, steady breathing filled the room.